Hi, everyone. Welcome to Just Say It, the podcast by communicators for communicators. On this show, we have in-depth conversations with journalists, messaging experts, designers, marketers, leaders, and managers, and unpack their wisdom and experience. Each episode is designed for strategic communicators looking to level up and advance their careers. I'm your host, Rochelle Bedell. Greg Eden is Vice President of Communications for Splunk. Reporting to the CMO, he leads the corporate communications and impact marketing teams for the $18 billion leader in cybersecurity and observability software. Greg joined Splunk in 2020 to create the company's first unified corporate communications and impact marketing program, and has since grown the team to 30 communicators, storytellers, and marketeers responsible for internal communications, public relations, executive communications, social media, influencer marketing, and global impact marketing. Prior to Splunk, Greg held a number of marketing and comms leadership roles. He was Chief Marketing Officer at Bright Machines, an early-stage manufacturing technology company that raised $180 million in 2018. He spent 8 years at Autodesk, leading the software company's brand, corporate marketing, and communications teams. Before joining Autodesk in 2010, Greg led comms functions and teams for Dell, VMware, and EMC. Greg holds an MA in Marketing Communications from Emerson College and a BA in Political Science from University of Richmond. Greg lives in San Carlos, California. When he isn't telling stories about Splunk, you can usually find him skiing with his wife and 2 kids in the Sierras. Welcome to the podcast, Greg.
Thank you. And your pronunciation was perfect. It was perfect.
You have to say that just to make me feel comfortable.
No, not at all. No, it was great. It was great. It's always awkward hearing someone talk about you. So you did great.
In your bio, you talked about both communications and impact marketing. And I think our audience is pretty familiar with what communication is. They're familiar with what marketing is. What is impact marketing? What does that look like and what's included in that?
Yeah. So our team, the impact marketing team, partners really closely with our chief impact officer and global impact organization at Splunk. So that's everything from our giving to our ESG reports and the ESG reporting. We started to support and promote a really interesting conversation around closing the data divide. You know, you've heard about the gap that has existed for decades, right, between those who have technology and those who don't. It's a very, very similar phenomenon that's happened with data and the ability to access data and use data. So the team that focuses on that, small but mighty, they work really closely with the impact team at Splunk.
So when you talk about an impact team, it sounds to me like they're really focused on the impact that Splunk has in the world, like basically doing good. Does that sound right?
Some of their work is often called Splunk for Good, and a lot of companies have organizations like that. That's exactly what they do.
Oh, super cool. So you're over communications, which are the general communications functions that we think about, but then it's also this other piece. So not specifically marketing Splunk products, but really talking about how Splunk is doing good and really getting that conversation out there so that people hear about it and can see the impact that Splunk is having.
Exactly. And an interesting way the teams have intersected, and I think communications leaders are seeing this more and more, is how a company responds to social issues as they emerge. The earthquake in Turkey and Syria, for example. On any given day, week, there is something happening in the world, and helping our leadership team, helping our employees or Splunkers, we call them Splunkers, helping communicate to them how they can engage or help support in those moments. For example, with the devastating tragedy that we're seeing in Turkey, that impact marketing team has been helping to lead the conversation with Splunkers, but also helping our leaders communicate out through their various social channels around how Splunkers can help support those in need over in that area. But it's just one example of many where there's a really close intersection between communications and impact marketing. And then the other area I would say is around storytelling and talking to our stakeholders. When we think of stakeholders within communications, we have 3 in this order: our people, Splunkers, our customers, and our investors. All 3 of those constituencies, for different reasons, are very interested in what we're doing from an impact perspective, from a philanthropy perspective.
And I think this really flows nicely into a conversation that we had before about the best communications happen when other people tell your story. And I'm sure this plays really nicely into impact marketing. Can you tell us a little bit about what you mean by that and how do you make it happen?
Yeah, sure. So I had a professor in grad school. He used to say their definition of brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room. And I really believe that, and take that to heart when it comes to communications. It's one thing to talk about your company, your product, yourself, and that's effective. But it's so much more powerful when your stakeholders speak on your behalf. If it's your employees, that is incredibly powerful, particularly when it comes to sharing your values, sharing what it's like to work and be a part of your company. And we can get into that a little bit about how we work with our employees to help them do that. When it comes to customers, really unleashing your customer's voice across the various mediums and channels that we work with, there's nothing more powerful than that. And then the final one I would say is the media, is press. The reason I have always gravitated towards media relations and press when it comes to the entire portfolio of marketing channels, because they are a true third party. They apply their filter to the marketing messages that often come out of companies. When done well, it's a more credible and more authentic way for your story to be told when it's being heavily vetted and told through the voices of others.
So I really want to dive into this media piece. I'm really curious about the credibility piece. But before we get into there, I want to talk employees and customers first. Where I work right now, we do try and engage our employees a little bit in some of our campaigns around social issues and things like that, just so they can share their experience and their thoughts and their values. But sometimes we have a hard time getting buy-in. We never want it to be inauthentic, meaning we don't want to pressure our employees into participating in a campaign like that. We really want it to come from them. When I say campaign, I'm talking about, like, for us, it would be like a messaging campaign. And I don't know if yours works that way. We're trying to share with our community the values of our employees that are also shared by the community. So that would be on our organization's channels through our organization, but it would be coordinated with employees that volunteered to be part of it. So I don't know how Splunk gets their employees to be part of this sharing the message. If you just encourage people to share it on their own social media, I mean, how do you encourage it and have it still be authentic, but still get the message out?
It comes down to something that we talked about in a prior conversation, is control, or kind of letting go of the control. The most authentic storytelling is when those storytellers say it in their own voice and in their own words. I'm not sure if this is where you're headed towards, but giving an employee a specific message or thing to say and repeat isn't authentic. The way we do it, giving our employees tools to activate their own authentic voices across social media. I don't know if you know, this is a stat that I'm obsessed with in my team. I think they roll their eyes every time I say it. There's something like 90% of your social graph, so your friends, 90% of those are unique to you. Somewhere around 10% you might share, if you've been at a company for a certain period of time, you might share those contacts with other colleagues at the company. But on average, 90%, so 9 out of 10 are unique. So if you share something and other employees share something, the network effect across social media is massive, because that message is touching so many new, unique readers. We do it a couple of ways. We use social advocacy tool. We call it Splunk AMP, but it's got an underlying platform that I've used at other companies, and other companies use it. It's pretty common. On a regular basis, a couple of times a day, we will serve up content that has the links and has some suggested copy if they want to use it, but really encourage them to make it their own. And that platform is already hooked into their various social platforms. So it's hooked into their Twitter, their LinkedIn, their Facebook, wherever they like to play, and they can publish. It just makes it really easy for them to publish. I think when it gets really successful, in terms of number of employees that have registered and use it, it's somewhere around half of our employees, but on a regular basis, the number's smaller. Success for me is when an employee gets comfortable enough to start to create their own original, authentic post. I see a lot of that in my stream from Splunkers, and that's the plan. That's the objective. Now, outside of social media, we do have spokespeople, and we have a spokesperson training program. So if we've got folks within the business, and we've got a lot of smart people at Splunk who are interested in telling our story, and particularly interested in telling our story within their domain. We've got a program where we, help them through the do's and don'ts, and also, when it makes sense, help get them into the right places where they can tell those stories.
Wow. So basically what I'm hearing is that you just remove the barriers so that your employees or your staff, I would say your team. So all the barriers are removed, and then they're free to tell whatever story they're comfortable telling.
Exactly. I heard a lot about Splunk before I came there, other than kind of a funny name, is the culture. Just a really strong strong culture, and the people are really special. And you can feel that working within the company. And I think you can feel that across the socials when you're seeing a Splunker tell their story. It really comes through, that pride. That's something you can't serve up. It's either there or it's not. And I'm fortunate to be working for a brand that it's very much there.
And with your spokesperson training, is that done in-house? Do you have people in-house that train your teammates on being a spokesperson, or do you outsource that piece?
It's a mix. We do have phenomenal PR agency partners around the world. And sometimes we do that training together, and sometimes we do it just in-house. One benefit of tapping into our agencies, our PR agency, which is, other than they're just great at what they do, is they bring a little bit more of a professor coach persona to the training. That can be a good dynamic. One other point to mention about media training and bringing your internal team into it, and having your internal team be actively involved in that media training, if not leading that media training, is it does elevate them as a more of a true business partner to the stakeholders they're working with within the company, the executives they work within the company. It also really helps as you progressing with the spokesperson through multiple opportunities, because you become their coach. As you're listening to them in one media interview or one engagement, you can give them feedback. And like any coach, repetition and consistency of that feedback really helps to improve both the end result, but the athlete, the spokesperson.
So tell me, is anyone on your team eligible for spokesperson training, or is it typically someone that's on the communications team or in an executive leadership role? Who's eligible for the spokesperson training?
Yeah, great question. Anyone where it makes sense for the business and where we have a business need. Now, that being said, we don't give spokesperson training as a development opportunity. We use it when we need it, when we have a gap, when we have either a domain expert or executive that we're going to be using with the media on a regular basis. So when we have a new country manager, for example, when a new leader joins the company or moves into a leadership position within a country outside of the US, they often have to carry a lot of the spokesperson responsibilities. We don't have as deep a bench of spokespeople in each country as we do in the US, because this is where we're headquartered. That's a place where we prioritize spokesperson training very quickly, because it's really important to get that right. And I'm sure other folks in roles like mine get this. Sometimes we're approached by folks within the company who want spokesperson training because they want to have that skill set. It's a really valuable skill set. We just don't have the scale and resources to train everybody.
So then what it sounds like to me is that typically your spokespersons are your managers, your leadership team. Are you also a spokesperson for the company? Because I know with some companies, they want their comms people to be the main spokesperson. And that always seems a little bit odd to me, because I feel like the best spokespeople are the subject matter experts. We can be there to help coach and train and help them be ready for those opportunities. But I don't know that I like the idea of the comms leader being the spokesperson. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
There are times when myself or a member of the comms team are spokespeople. It's often more around issues or when brief comment is required in a certain situation. But all of the communicators are engaging with external stakeholders, and the PR team is engaging with press all the time. So kind of a fine line between, does that make them a spokesperson or not? They're talking to the press all the time, but more often than not, when a reporter is looking to file a story, they would, to your point, prefer to speak with a domain expert or an executive or CEO or CFO. Here's a good example. Every quarter we announce earnings. Our team, comms team, we're talking to media in the days leading up and the day of and the day after. Some reporters will just, pull from the press release and pull from what we report and file their stories. Some reporters will want to do something a little deeper. And in those cases, we'll connect them with our CFO or sometimes our CEO to get those comments on the record and give that color to the story. I would say every communicator is a spokesperson. That's the way I look at it.
Yeah, I think the way you described it makes sense to me. And maybe the other situations that I've heard of, I've just misunderstood. Perhaps they mean what you just described. I just misinterpreted it to mean they wanted the communications person to be the main spokesperson, because what you described makes more sense to me. Because yeah, we are always there. The media, we are the first contact for the media. We're constantly fielding just the general basic questions. I can get you more facts about that. I can answer that question. But when it comes to, the real in-depth interviews or a lot of the on-camera stuff, at least in my experience, that's where we turn it over to the subject matter experts.
There are certain situations. One that's very topical right now is the technology industry, is experiencing significant reductions, right? Significant layoffs. And Splunk, unfortunately, also has had some impact. We announced at the start of February that we made the difficult decision to reduce our staff by around 4%. That was a little more than 300 positions globally. That was a case where on several occasions we engaged with media and provided them with a comment that they attributed to someone on my team, someone on the comms team. There are certain corporate, fast corporate stories like that where a reporter is just trying to get a company comment. And that's where I think that's where a classic use of a communications person as a spokesperson rather than an exec from the company.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so let's switch to empowering customers to be your storytellers. What does that look like? How do you do that? How do you keep it authentic? Let's hear about that.
Yeah, I love customer PR. I love it. You can see my gray hair. I've been doing this for for a couple of decades. And early on, I was working at EMC and had the opportunity to be the point person for telling all of their internet customer stories, all the .com stories in the late 90s, early 2000s, and got to spend time with all these just wonderful, innovative companies, a lot of them out here in California, but all over the world, in bringing their stories to life, as we were talking about before, rather than at the time EMC tell their story. I really got the bug then, and I've had it ever since. One thing that attracted me to Splunk and having a great time at Splunk is just the customers. We have, tens of thousands of customers, but more than 90 of the Fortune 100, for example, use Splunk to safeguard their enterprises, to make their enterprises more resilient, make sure that their digital operations keep going no matter what interruption, no matter what crisis is thrown at them. So for me, I love to put customers in a position to tell their Splunk story in their own voice. We have a user conference every year. Last year, we had Heineken, REI, a bunch of these really cool brands just on stage telling their Splunk stories. There's those controlled environments, but whenever possible, being able to provide a customer to a reporter to tell their Splunk story is just so powerful. So my philosophy is any medium we can find, take advantage of it, whether it's a major keynote like our user conference every year, or if it's fireside chat with our CEO, something we did with some of our government customers in DC in December. We featured one of our customers in a TED Talk that we took part in last year. Any opportunity to be able to put one of those customers out there is in whatever medium is possible is something that I always go for. It's my favorite thing to do.
How do you find the customer stories? Are you watching for them through internet channels or social media channels, or do you have teams that are in contact with the customers and maybe they saw the issue, they help solve it, and then they're like, oh, this might be a good story, connect them with the comms team? How does it work?
Yes, we have customer marketing team at Splunk led by a couple of awesome marketers. One is a recovered PR person, which is great. So she really gets what we do. They work with our sales teams. We have customer councils, and as most technologies companies do, we have some pretty awesome brands that work with Splunk. About half of our business comes from security. So it's a challenge because companies aren't usually too excited to tell the world about how their security works, for obvious reasons. That's always a challenge. Customer marketing team does a great job with that. But in partnership with communications, in particular the PR team, they're able to present, I think, pretty interesting value to those customers by being able to tell their story in again, authentic way, but tell it in a way that really shows them as leading in an area. It really shines a different aspect on that brand. I'll give you an example. Last year, Papa John's, Chipotle is another example. Those are two brands that you don't really think of as, technology leaders. But through work with Splunk, they were both featured in a variety of different publications showing how they were using Splunk and their customer data to improve their customer experience. Chipotle, for example, completely transformed the way, and actually Papa John's too, really transformed the way that they serve their customers through the pandemic. And they did that through technology, and in a big way, they did it through Splunk. And that was an example of they saw real value in connecting their brand to technology. Because let's face it, every business is a technology business now. Every business is a data business, and that was really good for them. So, and I could go on. REI, I mentioned already that story was really fun last year to tell. Heineken was a fun one to tell. Porsche was one that I didn't tell, but it was one of the things that got me in the door. We told this really fun story with Porsche right before I joined. It got my attention about Splunk, actually. Wow. At the time, not a Splunk employee, it made me want to be one. So there's value there. These customer stories don't only attract other customers, they help us recruit as well.
You're talking about all the brands that I love. And I think we all found that, especially during the pandemic, if these brands weren't willing to really take advantage of technology and really shift and adapt, they just weren't going to make it. So it's great that Splunk is able to partner and really help them build successful companies through these pivots and shifts. That put them ahead of the pack once we got out of the pandemic, because they had all these processes adapted that the other companies didn't have. And let's face it, we all came to expect it.
To that point, Zoom and Slack were another two brands or products that exploded in the pandemic. And we were right in the middle of both of those stories.
So tell me a little bit about media. You had mentioned that media is also very important, and that if you can get the media to tell your story, it builds credibility, because the media has more credibility than you telling the story yourself, or the company, the brand telling the story themselves. I just want to push back on that a little bit, just because, and I expect you to push back on me with this one, with the recent years and all the talk of misinformation, disinformation, and media having a natural bias one way or another with every story that they tell. How do you see that building credibility?
I could talk about this for days. I always bristle when I hear PR people talk about us versus them, or have that type of attitude towards the media. I have some really good friends that are reporters. With very few exceptions, every reporter I've worked with, they're just like us. They're trying to do a job, and do a job really, really well. They have very high standards for accuracy and truth. I don't think people have enough empathy for, when it comes to reporters, is that there's not a Splunk reporter or an IBM reporter or a, pick your brand, a Facebook reporter, right? I mean, there definitely are some of those larger companies. There are reporters that have that beat and are focused more on that company than some others, but they have to understand and learn and report on many, many, many different brands. And I appreciate that, and so whenever I engage with a reporter, I try to come at it with a place of empathy, and appreciate that they're just trying to do their job. I try to give them accurate and truthful information and help them tell a story. It's really as simple as that. There are exceptions, but for the most part, that's the way it goes.
So tell me, it can be easy to work with the media when they're telling a favorable story. They're talking about your company in a positive light, but there are lots of times when we find ourselves in a crisis situation, a situation that maybe isn't necessarily favorable for the company. How do you partner with the media when they're telling a story that doesn't show your company in a favorable light?
You start in the same place, appreciation that they're trying to do their job. I try to be a source for them, right? I try to help them as much as I can. If I'm approached with a story that is inaccurate, I'll do everything I can to help them avoid printing something that's just factually not true. If I'm approached with a story that is something I can't comment on, which happens a lot, there's Reg FD and you can't say something, I'll try to get back to them as quickly as possible and be as responsive as possible. I'm not going to be able to comment at this time. There have been many occasions when I've been in situations where a reporter will call and say, hey, a source has told me this. My response always is, okay, thank you. Let me get back to you as quickly as possible. Let me look into it. A couple of years ago, that happened. This one incident, it was about a company I was working at the time. I ran it down. I checked in with, all the powers that be within the company. Is this true? And I was assured it was not. So I went back to the reporter and they said, well, this source is pretty good. They're telling me it's true. I said, all I could say was, off the record, was that I'm hearing it's not. I tell you what, let's make a deal. If you can corroborate it with one or two other sources, come back to me and let's have a conversation. All the investigation I've done around this rumor that you've come to me with is that it's not true. It wasn't true, and I never heard from them again. And this happens, right? Unfortunately, the media can be fed a story by whether it's a competitor or maybe an investor or wants a certain narrative out there, and all you can do is help them do their job and be straight with them. That's critical. Never lie. Always be honest.
I think that's great advice. Let's switch over to internal communications for a minute. As we talked about before, like most companies, Splunk has been faced with a lot of turnover, a lot of challenges over the last few years. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how you managed that and helped keep employee morale up and help keep your employees or your teammates engaged through all that turnover and change as we've gone through, the pandemic and everything that's come with that?
Just to share a little bit of context there. If you go back to late 2021, our CEO, who had been our CEO for a long time, stepped down. And we had a period of transition where our chairman stepped in and was the interim CEO for a few months. And then about this time last year, Gary Steele joined us as CEO. And he's great. He's been great for the company. But if you take all that change in the executive leadership just below the CEO. There was definitely some change in and around those CEO transitions. You sprinkle in a little pandemic and some geopolitical upheaval around the world. It's a lot. It's a lot for anyone to take in, and it's been a lot of change for Splunkers. One thing that we've done right after Gary started was weekly town halls every single week. So we went from doing quarterly all hands to a weekly town hall, 30 minutes. We've done it every single week, pretty much since he started, with very few exceptions, the holidays, every single week. And it's the same format each time. Gary comes on, he welcomes new Splunkers who have joined in the week prior. He shares top of mind, either about the world or about Splunk, or a mix of both. We usually have one or two people come on and talk about something that's happening around Splunk. And then it's Q&A. And we really, really fiercely protect that Q&A time. At least a third of that 30 minutes is going to be focused on Q&A. And it's anything goes. We get lots of questions in. Gary, to his credit, does not shy away from the hard ones. And that level of dialogue and transparency has made a really big impact. The feedback's been great. And so that's how we've approached it from a Splunk-wide perspective, and worked out really well. And on top of that, we have your usual employee communications, written communications. We use Slack quite a bit, as most companies do now. But then within my team, we have regular team meetings across the comms team. We're also regularly meeting with the teams. One of the things that I find is most important is like what Gary does with the entire company, and my team and I try to do, is leave time for conversation and dialogue. Just talking through change is really important. The other thing I'd mention is time management. It's been a real challenge with the pandemic, right? Some people love the office life and really miss that. Some people love working remote. Splunk is choose your own adventure. If you want to go to the office, go to the office. If you want to work remote, 100%, go for it. It's really your decision, 100%. There's no mandatory come into the office days or anything like that. When you are remote, it's hard to keep that fine line between life and work. And I'm not saying that we've cracked it, because we haven't. But one of the things that we've implemented or tried to implement is a play on common phrase, which is get Splunk done. And what that means is we really try to protect Fridays and try not to schedule comms meetings on Fridays. Not always successful, but we really try to do that. We also try hard not to schedule meetings at the end of the West Coast business day and at the start of the East Coast business day. Communicators can all relate to this. There's nothing worse. You're in meetings all day and then you just start working. We have to write. We create things. We don't just talk for a living, right? It's nothing worse than having to wait until 5 o'clock, or worse, after all that, then start doing your work. It's not healthy. It happens. There's always times when it's going to happen, when there are, certain moments, but really try to figure out the remote thing and help people create those barriers. I don't know if you've ever met Clay Helm, VP of Communications at IBM. She's fantastic. We worked together at Autodesk, and she said something to me once, and I've never forgotten it. You're never going to have a job that says at 5 o'clock, you're done, go, that's it. That job is always going to be asking for more of you. In the world of communications, you probably could work 24/7. Got to help your teams find that line between work and life. Post-pandemic world, it's harder and harder to do that because everyone works remote.
2 comments. First, I want to say, isn't it ironic that the key to good relationships, whether it be your internal comms or working with the media or relationships with coworkers, friends, your spouse, whatever, it's all communications, right? It really comes down to, making sure you have that time to connect and be open and authentic and talk through hard things, answer the hard questions. I love that you found a way to implement it as a company, because I think that's a real challenge for a lot of companies, is finding that venue and finding the energy and the time to really make that happen. So good on Splunk for really making that happen.
I'll be the first to say we're trying. It's not perfect. There's work to do for sure. And we haven't solved it. I don't think anyone has, but we're trying.
And then secondly, hearing you talk about the hybrid work or the remote work and trying to figure out ways to make that happen. I'm just so proud of these companies that are really taking on these hard things, because from what I've seen, all the research shows people are happier when they have this hybrid option, whether it's fully remote or it's hybrid where you work from home 3 days a week and go into the office 2 days a week, whatever that balance is. But people tend to be happier and their work-life balance is better, which generally means their work output is better. They're finding that people are more productive when they're given that opportunity, but it does come with challenges and we haven't figured out how to solve them all yet. But I love that you and your teams and Splunk is really trying, rather than just throwing up your hands and saying, we can't figure it out, this is too hard, let's go back to the office because that's what we know.
At least certain jobs ever going back 5 days a week. You just see how productive you are, particularly if you have a commute. Not having that commute is wonderful, but don't really be fiercely protective of your time. Just because you're not commuting from 7 to 8, that shouldn't mean that you have to be on a Zoom from 7 to 8. Like in the morning, I'm talking, like really be fiercely protective of your time. So whenever I hear of my team on really early or a really late call, I always ask, is this an exception? And if it is, it happens. Splunk's a global company, and 7 o'clock for me is late afternoon for someone else, right? Or 7 o'clock in the morning, or 7 o'clock at night is the morning for someone else. And so we're going to make exceptions. What I really try to discourage is regular meetings with those times, those early morning meetings or late evening meetings. It's not good. Shouldn't do it.
Yeah. And I think it's such a gift as a leader. You are talking with your teams about this and kind of watching over them, because it helps give themselves permission to put that space in their lives, right? And I find I have to do my own self-talk about that sometimes. Like if I take a 15-minute break right now, which I know I really don't have time for, but if I take it, I'm going to work better and harder in the next 45 minutes because I will have taken a break, given my brain some time to rest, and then I'm going to be more productive. So my work quality will be better. I'll be happier. I'll feel better. I'll get more done. But I have to give myself permission to take this space right here. Hearing you say that you talk to your teams this way, I think is great, because not everyone has a manager that gives them that space. And so then they have to make the space themselves. And sometimes that can be difficult when the leadership is not vocal about it, or maybe that isn't their philosophy. And that gets to be a real challenge.
Agreed. 100%.
All right, let's move on into our Just Say It questions. These are questions that we ask at the end of every interview. Our first one is, if you could give one piece of advice to your younger self when you were just getting started in your career, what would it be?
Sort of related to what we were just talking about, but speak up. People can't read minds. To your point about work-life balance and having those barriers, managers should try to create those safe spaces to have that balance. But managers, leaders, they're not mind readers. Don't assume. Speak up, share what you're thinking, either if it's about your work or about opportunities that you see. That's probably the number one thing I would say. Don't assume that your manager or your leader is all knowing. If you see something that's not right, say it. If you see an opportunity that you want to go after, say it. Don't hope that you get picked, right? It's really just speak up. I think that would be one of my bits of advice for a younger Greg.
I love this because it's a way of empowering yourself to take more control over your situation and your work, because you're actually voicing what you're seeing, what you're feeling, hopefully ends up in giving you space to act on those. So it's a great piece.
One thing that I started to do a couple of years into my career in those meetings, maybe team meetings, is force yourself to always ask a question. Raise your hand, ask a question. Ask a good question, be sure that it's a question that's relevant to the conversation and will add to the conversation. When I was younger, it was really helpful because it started to build that muscle in me to just always speak up and engage.
Question number 2, what is one habit that you do daily that you would recommend to our listeners?
Engage outside of your universe. I try to talk and meet with at least one person, which sounds like not much. It can be hard because you get so sucked into your company and into your daily routine of meetings and whatnot. But I really try to, whether it's lunch or coffee or even just a Zoom with at least one reporter or industry colleague, someone outside of the company, to get that outside perspective. But in addition to that, I read constantly. It's the first thing I do in the morning. I'm old school. I go through the Wall Street Journal and New York Times every morning, and every night it's the information. I devour the information every night. People can get really sucked into their internal world, their company, and not have that outside perspective. And your ability to connect what's happening in the world as a communicator, what's happening in the world to what's happening within your company is your superpower. That is a communicator's superpower, I think, is connecting those dots.
I think this is such great advice. To round it out, I think what you're actually saying is just stay curious, staying curious about what's going on in the world, staying curious about the people around you. And when you're curious, you're constantly asking questions and finding out why and what's going on. And that builds this great well of knowledge and wisdom within you that you can use when you're talking to your CEO, or that you can use when you're planning these messaging campaigns and things like that, because you have a better understanding of this whole world around you and what's going on around you. It just creates this great situational awareness, and it builds your network and your friendship, and we all like that.
Be curious. I think that was that Ted Lasso, that classic Ted Lasso episode. Be curious. It's so true. It's so true. It's really important.
Absolutely. Well, Greg, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's truly been a pleasure. Tell us, where can our listeners find you?
Oh, LinkedIn is great. I'm on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, et cetera. But LinkedIn is probably the best way to reach out anytime.
We'll include your LinkedIn link in the show notes. And just thank you so much. It's been a great chatting with you, and I appreciate all the insights and the great conversation. So thank you.
Yeah, it's been fun. Thank you.
We have additional resources and links in our show notes at justsayitcommunications.com. Transcripts are up on the website, and the video is up on YouTube. My team is Andrea Casas-Tapete, Zara Momini, and Shinga Yoshimine. And my name is Rochelle Bedell. If you enjoyed this show, please like and share it. And don't forget to apply what you learn on the show. We hope you'll join us again soon for another conversation.